tonight's news edition. His Majesty begins a visit to Australia and holds talks on ties, the war on terrorism and the repercussions of the Syrian crises. The King says in an interview there cannot be a solution in Syria without the Russians, calling the situation in Aleppo a humanitarian disaster. And the lower house votes tomorrow on confidence in the government of Prime Minister Hani al-Mulki. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King held a series of meetings with Australian leaders at the start of a state visit to Australia. The King spoke of the need for closer coordination between Amman and Canberra on various issues. King Abdullah and the Governor-General of Australia discussed the war on terrorism and the repercussions of the Syrian crisis in talks attended by Her Majesty Queen Rania. Here's more.
Ties between Jordan and Australia, crises in the Middle East, and the war on terrorism figured high on talks between His Majesty the King and the Governor-General of Australia, Peter Cosgrove. The King and the Governor-General stressed shared values between the two countries, top of which is their keenness to achieve global peace. The talks also dealt with the burden being borne by Jordan as a result of hosting Syrian refugees. King Abdullah thanked Canberra for its support to countries hosting Syrian refugees. King Abdullah also stressed the need for continued regional and global efforts to fight terrorism. The Governor-General and his wife held a lunch banquet in honor of their Majesties King Abdullah and Queen Rania and the accompanying delegation. The King highlighted the strong Jordanian-Australian ties, pointing to a common interest to further boost cooperation in various fields. He pointed to threats posed by terror groups to the Middle East and warned against their attempts to spread terror and stir up strife among peoples and religions. Islam, the King said, is a religion of peace that calls on all believers to respect others. The Governor-General voiced hope that the King's visit will contribute to expanding ties, noting the two countries' common vision, mainly on the war on terrorism and the response to the humanitarian crisis in Syria. The Governor-General said Australia was looking forward to boosting relations in the security, scientific, economic and sports fields. Earlier, King Abdullah and Queen Rania were welcomed at the Government House with a 21-gun salute and a brass band playing the national anthems of the two countries. His Majesty met with the leader of the government in the Australian Senate, George Brandis, Justice Minister, and Assistant Prime Minister for Counter-Terrorism, Michael Keenan, as well as specialists in foreign affairs, defense, security, and counter-terrorism. Talks dealt with cooperation in fighting terrorism and the exchange of expertise in security and legal fields. King Abdullah said the fight against terrorism and its gangs require a holistic strategy, as terrorism threatens global peace and security. They agreed on the need to reach a political solution to the Syrian crisis to put an end to the suffering of Syrian people and preserve the country's unity. The King and the Queen visited the Australian War Memorial, where His Majesty laid a wreath and signed the visitor's book. Hala Dababne for the news at 10.
His Majesty the King said the destruction of Daesh should be everybody's responsibility and that unless we look at it in a global, holistic approach, we'll never win. In an interview with Australian ABC television channel, King Abdullah said he thinks there will be some changes to U.S. policy under the presidency of Donald Trump, but not to the extent that everybody is panicking about. He said there cannot be a solution in Syria without the Russians, adding that the situation in Aleppo is a tremendous humanitarian disaster. Here's a recording of the full interview.
Your Majesty, thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Tony.
Can I start with the big question on everyone's minds? Could Donald Trump's presidency be a game changer in the Middle East?
It will definitely, I think, change the status quo of a lot of issues that I think we've been dealing with. And we'll have to see how the transition team comes along and what their view of our part of the world, but also the rest of the world. So it's not just, I think, people in our region that are sort of waiting with bated breath. I think everybody is.
Yes. Do you think the world's leaders are waiting with their fingers crossed quietly behind their backs after such a divisive campaign?
Well, I mean, it's something that I think kept all of us busy for the past 2 years. I have had the opportunity to speak to President-elect Donald Trump last week. The synergy was very good in the phone call conversation. I know many members of the transitional team, and obviously America is also built on institutions. So there will be some changes in policy, but I don't think to the extent that everybody's panicking about. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt at this
One
stage.
of the, I guess one of the things that people are looking very closely at, the biggest conflict in the region in Syria. Are you at all concerned that President Trump will adopt what is essentially the Russian position of keeping President Assad and his regime in power indefinitely?
Well, I think all options are on the table at this stage. But again, I think I have to be very clear that I think most of us that understand Syria realize that there cannot be a solution without the Russians. And this has been something that all of us have been discussing for the past year or two. So at this stage, we have to wait to see what is the U.S. strategy, how they're going to deal with the Russians. I think this is what is on everybody's mind. But at the same time, I think you and I just briefly discussed before this interview, the concerns on the ground. So what happens in Aleppo, for example, which is a tremendous humanitarian disaster taking place. I don't think there's much we can do until the new administration is in place and a strategy is formulated and there is contact with the Russians. So on that level, on the ground level...
Is that what's happened, do you think? Because the Russians pretty much walked away from the peace process. They gave the excuse that the Allies are supporting al-Sham, which is an offshoot of the al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda-backed rebels in eastern Aleppo. But of course, it does seem to everybody that they're just really waiting until the inauguration of a new president.
I think from the Russian point of view, we get the sense there is a wait and see who was going to win the elections and the new administration to be in place. So I think that they felt somewhat emboldened to do whatever they felt they needed to do in Syria. But at the same time, it's difficult to put blames when it comes to negotiations on who walks away from whom. What we all hope is as the new administration comes in and it sets itself and its strategy, that there is some synergy. At the end of the day, we're dealing with a global terror problem, a new third world war by other means, as I said, not post-Cold War, where I had a feeling that there was more hatred between Moscow and Washington than there was against the extremists that we're dealing with globally. I hope that changes because the priority is actually against this global threat.
So do you think that Trump, Putin, some form of agreement between the two could be an opportunity in Syria? And would you be prepared? And do you think the broader alliance be prepared to see Assad remain in place if that was the Russians' will?
Well, we definitely need an opportunity because things have not been going extremely well from the political prospect over the past 6 months, if not slightly longer. So unless there's an understanding by the Russians and the Americans to begin with as the major players and by the rest of us, we're going to be here a year from now just looking at the tragedy on the ground. But I have to remind people also that even if you do have a political process going, whether that involves Assad or not, what people tend to forget, they think, oh, there'll be a political process and then we don't have to worry about anything else. The second part of that is there is a war against terror inside of Syria. That's going to take some time. So politicians think, oh, we've solved the politics, but the reality on the ground is going to be with us for much longer, and not just in Syria.
Just on that, you talked about synergies, and of course the Americans and the Russians have been talking about, even prior to this, setting up a joint operations base, a command to coordinate airstrikes. Do you think that's possible, and particularly would it be threatened if the Russians simply level eastern Aleppo with their aircraft in the meantime until January?
Well, so do people, as happens in many parts of our part of the world, try to create realities on the ground before people can sit around the table? So again, if we have now to wait until February, March, I think a lot of innocent people are going to suffer in the meantime. Having said that, on coordination, I know from firsthand that there has been some very successful coordination from the military aspect between the Russians and the United States on Syria and operations there. When the politics got worse or better, that obviously fluctuated. We hope that maybe now there's a new focus, but them sitting down around a table and agreeing is something that can be done. And we did see it on the military level in many parts of Syria.
Well, Trump has made it absolutely clear that his priority will be to destroy ISIS. If he needs the Russians' help to do it, he'll obviously seek whatever help he can get. Is it possible to actually do that?
But I think the destruction of ISIS should be everybody's priority. And I keep saying this is where the global war is today. I mean, we look at it as a war, a civil war inside of Islam, but we can't do it without the help of Christians and Jews and other religions and other nations, because this thing is not just located in Syria or Iraq. It's in Libya. We're dealing with Boko Haram and Shabab. You have the Al-Taliban, and actually in this neck of the woods you also have your challenges. So unless we look at this in a global, holistic approach, we're never going to win. And so we've got to be, using an American vernacular, chew gum and walk at the same time. And that's been, I think, the frustration in the past, where it's Syria today, Iraq tomorrow. But even if you see now pressures on Syria and on Iraq for ISIS, we have seen for the past year commanders going to Libya. So if we're going to wait a year or two until we deal with Libya, and if you're successful in Libya, it's going to put pressure down on the Boko Haram and the Shabab aspects in East and West Africa, and then we'll think, oh, we'll talk to the Africans 2 years from now. We're never going to get this right.
So you have to do it all at the same time. And since you've gone down that path, do you seek, or are you in the process of creating cooperation with Australia, sitting in the middle of this region with the largest Muslim country, Indonesia, just to our north?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Australia plays such a pivotal role in international affairs. You have a very capable special forces. We've seen them in our neighborhood over the past several years. So whether they work in our part of the world or whether we need to be able to nip it in the bud, so to speak, in certain regions here in the Far East, this is something that we have to do. I think your government understands that. We've had discussions along those lines. So have other responsible governments in the area.
Indonesia, have you been talking to the Indonesian government?
Yes.
And do you see Indonesia as being a critical part of this puzzle that you're trying to put together for a global war on jihadism?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Indonesia as being the largest Muslim country in the world, there is a great synergy between the populations there. You have a Muslim majority country, but you've also got Catholics. The relationship has always been a comfortable one. What we don't want is to lose the opportunity of making sure that everybody shares and works together and have to come back and visit, I'm not saying Indonesia, but other countries in the region, solve a problem from a military point of view 3 or 4 years from now. So I think coordination with Indonesia, supporting Indonesia in making sure that the extremist threat is limited and then eradicated in Indonesia is something that we need to think about.
Just looking at this incredibly complex equation, and particularly within Islam itself, where you've got the schism between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and on the Shia side you've got this power emerging of Iran. And the big question mark that a lot of people have now, since we have a nuclear peace deal the United States, Obama, struck with Iran, is whether Trump will be persuaded by Israel to drop that deal. What do you think? Do you think he would?
I wouldn't want to speculate on that. I'm sure there are concerns in our part of the world. And as you said, we do have some countries that have this Shia-Sunni tension. That's the least thing that we want now is an interreligious war. We have our problem inside of Sunni Islam, which is what we call the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam. These are the perpetrators that have done criminal acts in my country, in Europe, in yours. This is the franchise that we're dealing with. A Shia-Sunni conflict inside of the Middle East is opening Pandora's box. I mean, the fault line between Shiaism and Sunniism goes from Beirut to Bombay. So that's one last thing that we need. At this point, we need to concentrate against what we call the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam.
Do you think it's important that the United States, and it'll be in the hands of Congress as well as the President, keep a hold of that nuclear deal with Iran? Would it upset the balance of power if the Americans decided, urged by the Israelis, to drop it?
Well, Iran has been responsible in inciting sectarian conflict in our area. And again, when you look at the Iranians, they have several cards that they play. So one of them is the nuclear card, one of them is the card that I just mentioned. They do support organizations that sometimes are considered terrorist in nature. So I think when you look at Iran, you have to look at it in its totality. And again, it's too early for us to understand where the new American policy is going to be on that. Yeah. Everybody's going to have their opinion, but I think we've got to keep it in the bigger picture aspect of things.
Yeah, I'm thinking too how that might impact on Syria with Iran, Russia, the United States, and other Arab countries with really serious interests in Syria, whether that balance could be upset by something like that.
So exactly, there's so many different flavors out there. If you're going to sort of focus on one issue and make that the standard strategy for your administration, it's going to impact a lot of other things in the Middle East, all the way from Morocco to Yemen. So again, I can't put words into the new administration's mouth, but I think they're looking at it in the way the team is being put together is how do we look at it from a really strategic point of view. So if you're going to look at Iran, you have to understand that Iran does impact, Afghanistan on one side, but Iraq, Syria, Lebanon to an extent. We have issues in Yemen, and we have some problems in Africa. So how do we balance the new strategy of the administration with all those things integrated?
Now, you said you have good relations with people in the transitional team. And there's at least one member of the transitional team, General Michael Flynn, who's been pegged to become the National Security Advisor. And just in terms of this global war on jihadism that you're talking about, I'm wondering, could it upset that with someone like Flynn describing Islam as a cancer, a political ideology that hides behind the notion of a religion? As a National Security Advisor, could that damage relations? Could it damage the very thing you're talking about, which is trying to create a kind of global consensus to defeat jihadism?
Well, whatever comments are made on the campaign trail, I tend to put aside and give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think we should give the new administration the benefit of the doubt on this issue. And part of the problem, I think, that's been a major challenge and frustration from my point of view is, if you take some people at their word, is the complete lack of understanding of Islam and the challenges that we have. So when we say this is our civil war, the one that we're fighting, and I think most non-Muslims don't understand our religion. Do they know that we believe Jesus Christ to be the Messiah? The Virgin Mary is mentioned, I think, about 35 times in our Quran, only 25 times in the Bible, but the Bible is a lot bigger. Moses is mentioned 130 times in the Quran. So you have to understand that as a true Muslim, we believe in the Bible, the Torah, as well as the Quran. We have to have a belief in Judaism and Christianity as the other two monotheistic religions. It's those that don't understand, and it's the enemy that want to create this atmosphere that it's actually us against them. And this is where I think we're going to fall into major trouble over the next couple of years if it's us against them mentality. We're actually all in the same trench, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, against what I keep calling the outlaws of our
I suppose I can speak on behalf of many people in the world when I say one hopes that you might one day get in a room with Donald Trump to explain that. I mean, will you have that opportunity?
I'm hoping that we will have an opportunity. As I said, I had a very good conversation with him on the phone. I met him a couple of times before, many years ago. And we have good contact with many people in his team. And I think there's an understanding, and I think that others, especially in Europe, who understand the threat from the government point of view, speak the same language that I do. Understanding where the threat is inside of Islam. It's a spectrum. There's probably not enough time in this interview to go through it. But if you understand that it's actually in the last 10% of Sunni Islam where the problem is, and even in that 10%, so probably
those people you describe as the outlaws.
The outlaws of Islam. If once they understand where it is in Islam the threat is, and understand that spectrum, then we'll be able to deal with the horror and the challenge much easier. Even I think inside of your own societies, understanding where the problem springs from and how to identify the threat. And that's the problem with most people, I think.
I think we can actually go back in history a little bit, because there is a long history of the emergence of these kind of outlaw groups within Islam, going almost back to the first century of its existence.
Absolutely, and they were so atrocious when they first appeared on the scene that Islam stood up against them and they were eradicated. And what I think,
do you think that will happen now?
More and more, this is where the alliance is coming from, and I think this is probably the challenge that you're having, sometimes we have with the West, is where a lot of us in the region are now into the battle of this, and when we hear of peace initiatives or discussions for promoting governments, Libya is a prime example, where a lot of us see certain individuals on the ground that are actually taking the fight to the extremists. At this stage, people want to come in and look at the democratic process of Libya, and we're saying, guys, we're in the middle of a war, and the war for us is very clear. It's them against us. And I think that's the problem. And as I said, that is a small percentage that we're up against, that cherry-pick the Quran to sort of say it's okay to blow yourself up and kill innocent people, to subjugate women. That's got nothing to do with our religion. So we Muslims are the first people that need to stand up and say this is our fight. But we can't do it by ourselves.
Yes, and on the other side of the equation, we see the emergence of right-wing groups through Europe, a right-wing splinter group taking a section or cross-section of power in Australia even, and of course big question marks over the new administration and the way they will feel about Muslims. You've got Donald Trump, for example, talking about banning all Muslims coming to his country during the campaign. How dangerous is it, if you want to fight a global war against jihadism, to allow these voices to become prominent?
Yeah. So whatever, as I said before, whatever is said on campaigns, I take with a pinch of salt. And I think, give the new administration the benefit of the doubt. The problem with that type of rhetoric, it falls right into the lap of what the extremists, the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam want, because they feel that the only way that they can get global supremacy is to take the 90% of moderate Sunnis, make them feel isolated, picked on and marginalized, so that they are shifted over to the radical camp. So the more that you get these extremist statements said all over the world, we're actually doing exactly what the Khawarij want.
Does it make you despair when you see that happening? Because
every day.
It's all fed in by the Syrian conflict, the flow of refugees, the massive flow into Europe, and then the emergence within those groups of what some refer to as Trojan horse individuals or small groups of radicals.
But it also has, I think, most of us Muslims equally despairing when we see a small element of Islam in the name of Islam, saying things and doing things that have got nothing to do with our religion. From the traditional schools of Islam, it is almost impossible for any of us to put a bomb on ourselves and think that it's a good thing to blow yourself up in a marketplace and kill innocent people. I mean, when we say strong Christian moral values, we look at each other and say we have strong Muslim values also. Those are the people that understand humanity and mercy. These people that we're dealing with are just the enemy of all of us, because they have no concept of what religion is all about.
Now, again, because you mentioned the danger of this, these emerging voices from the right who are basically saying stop all refugees, stop all migration and so on, without naming any particular individuals making those statements. Would it worry you if in Europe a situation emerged where the European governments decided to do what Australia did, turn back the boats, turn back boatloads of Syrian refugees heading for Europe?
Well, look, I mean, we all have to understand people's insecurities, because it has been a very rough couple of years, and it's not something that's going to be fixed in a day or two. We're hoping that in the short term, the military aspect of this thing is done, but then the longer term aspect is the ideological warfare that's going to take at least a good decade. You can understand countries that feel their sense of insecurity because of terrorism and because certain people could be labeled coming from that sector. You know, we accepted, as 20% of our population now is Syrian refugees.
1.3 million people in your country.
2.5 million who have been through Jordan at one time or another of Syrian refugees. It doesn't count the Libyans, the Yemenis, and some of the Iraqis that we already have in our country. But out of the Syrians, exactly. And I was asked many questions by Jordanians that were getting just as frustrated seeing that 20% of their country are now Syrian refugees, the impact it has on jobs, on property, on unemployment. And they ask me, stop the Syrians coming into the country. And I say, how? When you have a mother, a pregnant mother with a child in the hand trying to cross the border, how are we going to stop her? I mean, do we sort of point bayonets at these people that are running away from horrible and threatening lives? There is a level of humanity that we have to reach out to each other. So it's very easy to say, let's not do that. But we do also have a moral responsibility.
Your Majesty, that does seem quite a good place for us to leave the interview. I know you've on a tight schedule here, and we thank you very much and appreciate the time you've given us.
Thank you very much, sir. Great pleasure.
Here in Amman, Lower House Speaker Atif Tarawne said that the legislature will vote tomorrow on confidence in the government of Prime Minister Hani al-Mulki. The Prime Minister and cabinet members have been attending a marathon debate of the government's policy statement. Over the past 4 days, lawmakers addressing the legislature outlined their observations on key points in the government's approach towards various domestic and regional issues. They urged the government to address economic hardship with a focus on job creation and poverty alleviation and spurring investment in job-creating sectors. The MPs also aired the demands of their constituencies, top of which are education, health and infrastructure services, and urged the government not to hike taxes and the prices of commodities, oil and electricity. Lawmakers called on the government to forge ahead with reforms and take a heavy-handed approach to fighting corruption and nepotism and the drug trade. Some called for salary hikes for civil servants and military and civil retirees. Other MPs blasted a gas import agreement from Israel and urged the government to carry out its role in defending holy shrines in occupied Jerusalem. Ahead of the confidence vote, Prime Minister Hani al-Mulki continued a series of meetings with parliamentary blocs. Deputy head of the Adale Justice Bloc, MP Ahmed Lawzi, said his bloc advocates dialogue to address economic, social and political challenges. The MPs stressed social equality, fighting corruption, curbing government spending and directing investment to remote areas with a focus on projects that contribute to solving the problems of poverty and unemployment. Mulki said the government is keen to build a solid relationship with the lower house based on credibility, transparency and achievement. The Prime Minister also met members of the Watan Homeland Bloc headed by MP Ibrahim Dur, who demanded details about the gas agreement from Israel and Royal Jordanian's debt. The Watan Bloc demanded that the government pay due attention to undeveloped areas to attract investments to them and expand the Social Security Corporation investments. Syrian government forces advanced towards the rebel-held city of Douma near Damascus. The army targeted the outskirts of the city with tanks and other weapons as they attempted to recapture the area from the rebel forces. Tanks and gunfire strafed the area and smoke rose from damaged buildings. Douma lies in a small rebel-held enclave to the northeast of Damascus, surrounding the Syrian government forces and their allies. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, said the dialogue and cooperation between Russia, the United States and other major powers and regional players is crucial for providing humanitarian assistance in Syria and resolving the conflict.
Controversies, open controversies, diplomatic conflict between big powers and powers influential in a conflict like Syria is a big obstacle for humanitarian work. The consequence of divisions between the big powers at the end of the day, that this is a free space of all those who want to continue the conflict. If the big powers don't nudge themselves together and try to influence the parties so that they behave, if they leave the space open, if the signal is we are not really making an effort because we are in deep disagreement, this opens a space for the continuation of the conflict.
Iraq's counterterrorism forces escorted groups of civilians out of the Khojaly district on the eastern outskirts of Mosul as fighting with Daesh continued. Children, young men and women, still shrouded in black robes imposed by the terrorist group, were helped onto military trucks as they streamed out of the area carrying their belongings. The terrorists have been steadily retreating from areas around Mosul into the city since the battle started on October 17th with air and ground support from a US-led coalition. As of last Monday, the number of registered displaced people was close to 70,000. And finally, very cold conditions prevail for the rest of tonight, with local rain expected in the southern and eastern regions. Tomorrow, unstable weather conditions continue to affect the kingdom, the tangible drop in temperatures and scattered rain in the southern and eastern regions, gradually extending to the central parts of the kingdom. Winds will be easterly brisk, turning dusty in the southern and eastern regions. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect moderate conditions with possible light rain, northerly moderate winds and rough seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty begins a visit to Australia and holds talks on ties, the war on terrorism and the repercussions of the Syrian crisis. The king says in an interview there cannot be a solution in Syria without the Russians, calling the situation in Aleppo a humanitarian crisis. And the lower house votes tomorrow on confidence in the government of Prime Minister Hani al-Mulki. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.